happened on a chilly October evening, the kind of night where the air feels electric and shadows play tricks on your mind. I was staying at my aunt's house in rural Vermont, helping her settle into the creaky old farmhouse she'd inherited from a distant relative. It was just me and my cousin Emma, who was 13 and had a knack for finding the spooky in everything. The house, with its peeling wallpaper and dimly lit hallways, provided the perfect backdrop for her imagination. Emma had recently acquired a second-hand doll from a local antique store, a porcelain-faced figure with glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. She called it Ivy and insisted it was her new best friend. I found the doll unnerving, but Emma adored it, cradling it in her arms like a real child. That evening, after dinner, we sat in the living room, Emma sketching in her notebook while I browsed my phone. Ivy sat upright on the coffee table, its painted lips curved into a permanent, knowing smile. The house was unusually quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled. Aunt Margaret had gone to bed early, leaving us alone downstairs. It started with a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of fabric. I glanced up from my phone and saw Emma staring at the doll. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked, feigning disinterest. Emma leaned closer to Ivy, her expression skeptical yet curious. "It sounded like breathing." I laughed, brushing it off as her overactive imagination. "It's probably just the wind," I said, though there wasn't a single draft in the room. Minutes passed and the atmosphere grew heavier. The doll's presence felt more pronounced, as if it had taken on a life of its own. Emma seemed to sense it too, her sketches growing more frantic as she avoided looking at Ivy. The uneasy silence was broken by a faint scraping sound. It came from the doll, or so it seemed. I walked over to the coffee table and picked Ivy up. Her glassy eyes stared back at me, unblinking. I turned her over in my hands, inspecting every inch. That's when I noticed something odd. Her back panel, where you'd typically insert batteries, was slightly ajar, but there were no batteries inside. "Emma, did you mess with this thing?" I asked. "No," she said, her voice shaky. "Why?" "It's just weird. There's no power source, yet it feels warm." I set the doll back on the table, a chill running down my spine. Emma stood abruptly. "I don't like it," she said, her tone firm. "Let's put it away." Ivy had other plans. As Emma reached for the doll, it toppled over, landing face down on the table. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Emma yelped and stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. "Relax," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I picked the doll up again, its face now smudged with a faint gray streak that hadn't been there before. Turning it upright, I noticed its eyelids. Those unnerving, lifelike lids had closed slightly, almost as if the doll were sleeping. The scraping noise returned, louder this time, followed by a faint whispering. The sound seemed to emanate from the walls, but when I pressed my ear against them, there was nothing. Emma clutched my arm, her voice barely audible. "It's her." The whispers grew louder, distinct enough to recognize fragmented words. "Let me out," they seemed to say. Emma's grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin. "Put her in the attic," she pleaded. I grabbed the doll and headed for the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. The attic door was stiff and groaned as I forced it open. The musty air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten memories. I placed Ivy on an old rocking chair in the corner and backed away, watching as the chair began to sway ever so slightly. I slammed the attic door shut and bolted downstairs. Back in the living room, Emma and I sat in tense silence, neither of us daring to speak. The house was eerily quiet, and for a moment, I convinced myself it was over. Then came the thudding, soft at first, like the sound of footsteps, but growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from above. "No," Emma whispered, her face pale. "She's coming back." I grabbed a flashlight and crept upstairs, Emma reluctantly following close behind. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the thin sliver beneath the attic door. My heart raced as I reached for the doorknob, the thudding now a deafening drumbeat. The moment I opened the door, the noise stopped. The attic was still, the rocking chair empty. Ivy was gone. Emma let out a gasp, pointing to the corner of the room. There on the floor lay the doll, her glassy eyes wide open, staring directly at us. In her tiny porcelain hand was a shard of glass from a broken picture frame. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and noticed something carved into the wooden floorboards beneath the doll. "Set me free," it read. Emma bolted, her footsteps echoing down the stairs. I stood frozen, torn between fear and curiosity. Then the doll's head turned. It was slow, deliberate, as if it wanted me to see. Her unblinking eyes locked onto mine, and a faint smile spread across her painted lips. I ran. Down the stairs, through the living room, out the front door. Emma was already outside, tears streaming down her face. "We have to tell Aunt Margaret," she said. We didn't sleep that night. The police were called, though explaining the situation felt ridiculous. They searched the house, finding no sign of forced entry, or of the doll. Aunt Margaret chalked it up to overactive imaginations and the stress of moving. But Emma and I knew better. Weeks later, I returned to the farmhouse to help Aunt Margaret with some repairs. I hesitated at the attic door, debating whether to confront my fears. When I finally opened it, the room was as I'd left it, except for one detail. On the rocking chair sat Ivy, her smile wider than before, her glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light. I never went back. Emma refused to talk about that night, and Aunt Margaret eventually sold the house. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Ivy and wonder if she's still waiting, biding her time in the shadows of that old farmhouse. The night was bitterly cold, the kind that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I had just moved into a small cabin on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona, nestled in a dense forest of towering pine trees. It was my retreat, a quiet escape from the chaos of city life. But that night, the solitude felt unnerving. The cabin had floor-to-ceiling windows in nearly every room, a feature I had loved when I first saw the place. During the day, they bathed the cabin in sunlight, and at night, they provided an unparalleled view of the starry sky. But without curtains, they also left me feeling exposed, like the forest was watching me. I told myself I'd buy blinds eventually, but I hadn't made it a priority. That decision would haunt me. I had stayed up late reading, wrapped in a blanket on my bed. The soft glow of my bedside lamp illuminated the pages as I turned them, the silence of the forest broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I didn't notice the first sound at first. It was faint, almost dismissible, but when it came again, louder this time, my heart skipped a beat. A single deliberate tap against the window. I froze, my eyes darting toward the glass. The bed faced a large window that looked out into the forest, but all I could see was my own reflection against the black void outside. I told myself it was nothing, a tree branch maybe, or a bird. The logical explanation was always the easiest to accept, but deep down, I knew it wasn't either. The tap came again, harder this time, like the deliberate knock of a fist. My chest tightened as I realized someone was outside. Who would walk all the way to my cabin in the middle of nowhere at this hour? The forest was pitch black, and the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. I stared at the window, willing myself to stay calm, but my mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I considered ignoring it. Maybe if I stayed perfectly still, they'd think I wasn't home and leave. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, the thought of someone standing just beyond the glass, watching, became unbearable. I turned my head slightly, trying to get a better look, but the glare from the lamp made it impossible to see anything outside. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. I thought it was over until I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My breath caught as the sound grew closer, then stopped directly below the window. I strained to listen, every nerve in my body on edge. And then, a face appeared, just for a split second, illuminated by the faint glow of the lamp. A dark silhouette, eyes locked onto mine, before vanishing into the darkness. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and steady as I explained what was happening, but it did little to ease my fear. They assured me an officer was on the way, though I knew it would take time to reach such a remote location. I stayed on the line, clutching the phone like a lifeline, when I heard the footsteps again, this time moving toward the front door. The wooden porch creaked under their weight. I bolted out of bed, trying to keep my movements quiet, and locked the bedroom door. The cabin's front door had a deadbolt, but I couldn't remember if I had locked it earlier. My pulse thundered in my ears as I heard the faint sound of the doorknob rattling. The operator was still on the line, urging me to stay calm and find a safe place to hide. The bedroom had no closet, and the thought of being cornered in such a small space made my stomach churn. I decided to risk it, gripping the phone tightly. I crept toward the door and unlocked it as silently as I could. My plan was to slip into the bathroom at the end of the hall, which had a small window I could escape through if necessary. I stepped into the hallway, every shadow feeling like it might spring to life. The front door rattled harder, followed by a loud thud. They were trying to force it open. I picked up my pace, the creaking floorboards beneath my feet betraying my movements. Just as I reached the bathroom, I heard glass shatter. My heart plummeted. They were inside. I locked the bathroom door and crouched down, keeping my voice low as I updated the operator. They assured me the police were minutes away, but seconds felt like hours. I heard heavy boots on the wooden floor, moving slowly, deliberately, as if the intruder was savoring the hunt. A sudden bang against the bathroom door made me stifle a scream. They knew I was in here. Desperation took over. I grabbed a porcelain vase from the counter, ready to use it as a weapon if they broke through. The pounding on the door grew louder, more violent, until it abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I couldn't tell if they were still outside or if they'd moved to another part of the cabin. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension, growing louder as they approached. Red and blue lights flashed through the small bathroom window, and I heard the intruder's footsteps retreating. When the police arrived, they found no one. The front door was wide open, and a shattered window in the living room confirmed my fears. Someone had been inside. They searched the area but found no trace of the intruder. The officers suggested it might have been a vagrant or someone passing through, but their tone lacked conviction. As they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was hadn't just stumbled upon my cabin. They'd been watching. The next day, I drove into town and bought heavy curtains for every window. But no matter how much I try to rationalize it, I can't forget the face I saw in the window or the sound of boots echoing through the cabin. I moved out a month later, unable to stay another night in a place that had once felt like a sanctuary. Even now, in a new home miles away, I can't look at a window after dark without feeling like someone is staring back at me. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside of Denver, Colorado. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and summer days were spent riding bikes and playing basketball in cul-de-sacs. I was 12 years old and had just started middle school. Making friends wasn't my strong suit. I was shy, and most kids in the neighborhood were either older or already part of their own cliques. So when Ethan, a 16-year-old who lived a few streets over, invited me to shoot hoops one afternoon, I jumped at the chance. Ethan was tall and lanky, with a mop of messy brown hair that hung over his eyes. He was a bit of an oddball, always talking too much or saying things that didn't quite make sense. But he was friendly, and I figured having an older friend would be cool. We started hanging out regularly, mostly playing basketball or video games at my house. My dad was thrilled I had made a friend, even if Ethan's quirks sometimes made me uneasy. At first it was fun. Ethan seemed to know everything about basketball, and he taught me tricks I'd never thought to try. But as the weeks went by, he became clingy. He'd call me constantly, leaving long, rambling messages if I didn't pick up. If I wasn't home, he'd show up at my house uninvited, ringing the doorbell until someone answered. My dad thought Ethan was just a lonely kid and encouraged me to be kind, but I started to dread his visits. One day, Ethan asked if I wanted to hang out at his place. I hesitated. I'd never been to his house before, and something about the way he asked felt off, like he was daring me. But I didn't want to seem rude, so I agreed. His house was at the end of a dead-end street, a small, run-down place with overgrown grass and peeling paint. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by a rancid smell, like a mix of mildew and spoiled food. The living room was a mess, with dirty clothes and fast food wrappers scattered everywhere. A cracked coffee table sat in the middle of the room, and there was a large, dark stain on the carpet that I tried not to look at. "This is my dad," Ethan said, gesturing toward a hulking figure sitting in a recliner in the corner. The man barely glanced at me, his face shadowed by the dim light of the TV. He grunted in acknowledgement before taking a long drag from his cigarette. His eyes lingered on me just a second too long, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Ethan led me to his room, which was somehow even messier than the living room. The walls were covered in posters of basketball players and heavy metal bands, and the floor was littered with more dirty clothes and empty soda cans. He seemed unfazed by the chaos, flopping onto his bed and grabbing a controller. "Want to play?" he asked, holding out the second one. I nodded, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. As we played, Ethan kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, his smile never quite reaching his face. I made up an excuse about needing to get home for dinner, but his expression darkened. "You don't have to go yet," he said, his tone almost pleading. When I insisted, his smile faded entirely, replaced by a cold, blank stare. "Fine," he said flatly, "but don't forget, you're my best friend now." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I mumbled a quick goodbye and practically sprinted out the door. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I told myself I'd keep my distance from Ethan, but he didn't make it easy. The calls became more frequent, and when I stopped answering, he started sending emails. One night, after ignoring several of his calls, I found 5 new emails in my inbox, all from an address I didn't recognize but immediately knew was his. The subject lines ranged from "You can't avoid me" to "I know where you live." My stomach churned as I read the messages, each one filled with increasingly unhinged ramblings about how I was his only friend and how I'd regret ignoring him. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of loud banging on the front door. I peeked through the blinds and saw Ethan standing on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. My dad answered the door, and I watched as Ethan handed him a small box. He left without saying a word, his head hanging low. When my dad opened the box, we found a photo inside, one of me and Ethan playing basketball, taken from a distance. My dad dismissed it as harmless, but I felt sick. Ethan had been watching me. That night, I lay awake in bed, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard something outside my window, a faint rustling, like someone walking through the bushes. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. Ethan was standing in the yard, staring up at my room. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream for my dad, but something about the way Ethan stood there, completely still, made me afraid to make a sound. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator as I explained what was happening. She assured me an officer was on the way. Minutes later, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. I peeked out the window again, but Ethan was gone. The police searched the area but found no sign of him. My dad, finally realizing the severity of the situation, called Ethan's house the next day, but there was no answer. A week later, Ethan's house was empty. His dad had packed up and left without a word. I thought it was over, but the emails started again, this time from a different address. They were shorter now, more cryptic. The last one I received simply said, "I'll see you soon." It's been years since then, but I still check over my shoulder whenever I walk down the street. I never saw Ethan again, but every so often, I dream about that night. The way he stood in the yard, unmoving, his shadow stretching across the grass like a stain that would never fade.